This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and I'm with David Miller, who was a professor at the University of Bristol in the United Kingdom. And David has been engaged in a long struggle over dealing with the issue of Israel and Zionism. And as a result of that, he's been targeted. And recently he was fired by the University of Bristol. So for those who don't know him, why don't you introduce yourself, David, and talk about, first of all, how you got involved in the issue of the role of Israel and Zionism.
So I'm a sociologist. I have been interested in questions of power, propaganda and lobbying since the beginning of my career. I started off looking at the conflict in the north of Ireland, where there are actually, interestingly, very many parallels with the situation in Palestine. I kind of got interested in Zionism and the whole question of secular colonialism in Israel-Palestine as a result of engagement in work on the Iraq War. So post 9/11, I became interested again in conflict in a big way, in propaganda around conflict. So I wrote about the drive to war in Afghanistan. You can see behind me on the shelf front cover of a book I did on Iraq and propaganda back in 2003. And as a result, we got into looking at the neocons in the US, and in particular, looking at the way in which neoconservative ideas were spreading across Europe. So the creation and institutionalization of neoconservative think tanks in the UK and Italy and France and many other European countries. And I started to do that work in around about 2008, 2009. And that was the first time that I was mystified. I was accused of being an anti-Semite, and I didn't really understand what was going on there. And so I wanted to find out more about that. And it was in finding out more about that I found out more about Zionism and became much more interested and understood much more about the role of Zionism in the neoconservative movement, yes, but also skipping forward a little bit in the promotion of ideas about terrorism, extremism, about Islam, which suited the interests of the Israeli state but were used in an attempt to drive the policy in Western states in a more authoritarian direction.
And for those who don't know, what was the role of Israel in the invasion of Iraq by the United States?
Well, it's not that that it had a direct role in the invasion of Iraq, although it did have a role. I mean, it's more that the role of the neoconservative movement in the Iraq invasion, both in this country and in the US, was significant. And when you look back into that, you see that the neoconservative movement comes out of effectively in the US the Zionist movement, and many of the neocons, of course, as everyone who writes the history of that period says, were when they were young kids, they were Trotskyists, and they moved from Trotskyist left to the non-communist left. They entangled themselves with the CIA, and then by the 1980s they were to the right of the CIA and pushing for a neoconservative foreign policy, as opposed to the traditional realist foreign policy of people like traditionally Kissinger and the like. So there was that, but then the attack after 9/11, especially after 7/7 in the UK, the 7/7 bombings in the UK, the attack on Muslims in general was something which became effectively the preeminent form of racism in the UK, and I think in the US too, and that was led by counterterrorism policies of the UK, for example, what's known here as the Prevent policy, which targets Muslims and systematically discriminates against Muslims in this country. And that policy was, of course, encouraged by the neocons and by the Zionist funders of the neocons, and indeed by parts of the Zionist movement more generally. And the Zionist movement, we were also able to show, was active in funding parts of the conservative movement further to the right than the neocons. So that's the far right, the counter-jihad movement, and all your famous American Islamophobic organizations, Middle East Forum, David Horowitz Center, all the ones that are well known in the US, funded to a large extent by Zionist philanthropies, which are also engaged at the same time, of course, in funding activities beyond the Green Line in Jerusalem and in the settlements in the Golan Heights and formerly in Gaza. So what became clear was that the Zionist movement has a key role in moving counterterrorism policy to the right towards a more overt anti-Muslim agenda, as well as having a role in encouraging Islamophobic street movements. And we started to write about this and to write about Islamophobia, and that was what got me into trouble. Originally, was that I did a lecture at the University of Bristol on Islamophobia and discussed the role of the Zionist movement in some of this. It's not the only factor pushing Islamophobia, of course, and we say that the state is the main factor pushing Islamophobia, but we do identify a specific role for the Zionist movement. And that led to complaints which were initially rejected by the university, a long investigation where I was cleared. And then—
What did they charge you with for an investigation at that time?
Well, I mean, the first complaint was about the lecture, where I'd outlined what we call the 5 pillars theory of Islamophobia, where the state is the backbone, the first pillar, and then there are other social movements, the neocons, the Zionists, the counter-jihad movement in the far right, and elements of the left, kind of pro-war left, anti-Islam left, which together are, we say, the main factors which push forward Islamophobia in the contemporary period. And so they complained about that. They complained that I'd mentioned the Zionist movement. They complained that this was anti-Semitic, that I was talking about Jewish organizations as opposed to Zionist organizations. And they tried to suggest that that was what the slides I'd used had indicated, when it was perfectly apparent that they didn't indicate that. And what we were talking about was a specific political movement called Zionism, which has particular commitments, which are not secrets, and particular connections to each other, which are again not secrets, which are organizational. And so that's what we were suggesting. And then later on, when I made comments about Zionism and about the relationship of Zionism to racism, and to the question of ethnic cleansing in Palestine, the settlement of and the stealing of land in Palestine, that was said to be anti-Semitic. And I was investigated directly for this by the university, and I was on 3 separate occasions entirely cleared of being anti-Semitic. Big surprise, but nevertheless, the campaign didn't let up. And what's happened eventually is that they've sacked me for making comments which they claim have upset Jewish students, and that's my crime.
And also, the Zionists have pushed this language about what is anti-Semitism, correlating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. Why don't you talk about that whole scheme or plan to basically say anyone that's a critic of Israel is also anti-Semitic?
Well, I mean, it's very interesting. I've been doing quite a lot of work on this as it happens over the past 2 to 3 years, in particular in the context of the attack in this country on the leadership of the Labour Party when it was led by Jeremy Corbyn, who of course was removed partly after pro-Israel activists got— and
Ken Loach as well has been expelled from the Labour Party for being an anti-Semite.
That's right. I mean, completely absurd. But there's been a long-term campaign by, I'm going to say the Israeli government, but let me qualify that in a second, to blur the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and to start to say that actually anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There is no gap. There's no distinction, and that goes back really, first of all, to 1967 and the period after the annexation of the Golan Heights of Sinai Desert and the territories in the West Bank and Gaza, when they started to come under a lot of criticism, much more criticism than they had previously been under, and they started to make this argument that there was a new anti-Semitism. So I wanted to look back at this because in the contemporary period, that's what they're trying to do. So I wanted to look back at what the history of this was. And I mean, as it turned out, this goes back a long, long way, back to the campaigns against Soviet anti-Semitism in the 50s and the 60s, which we now know, because documents have been released by the Israeli government, was simply a campaign led by the Israeli government's secret intelligence unit called Mativ, or the Lishka, the Bureau, as it was known. And even further than that, such that in the 1940s, before the creation of the State of Israel, there was an organization in the US which was spying on Arab Americans who were campaigning against the creation of the State of Israel. And they were spying on that organization and sending the information to the armed forces of the Haganah, the forces which became the IDF, and indeed to the FBI. And that organization that still exists today is the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. So, I mean, that's an indication that the whole question of the separation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the attempt to blur it goes way back to even before the creation of the State of Israel. That's something we found out recently. But to take it forward a step, I mean, that the really concentrated effort to do this has been accomplished through the Global Forum for Countering Anti-Semitism, which was set up in 2000 by Sharansky, and had its first big meetings in 2007 to 2008. And if you look back at the documents, many of the documents are still online for these conferences, you see the argument that what has to be done here is we have to create the idea that anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism, and we have to find ways to discuss that and to convince people of that. And that's what that process leads directly to the European Union Monitoring Centre's working definition of anti-Semitism, which was then junked by the European Union, but was taken up by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association, the IHRA definition, and which is the one which has been adopted by the Labour Party in this country, by many other governments, by my university. In the middle of the complaint against me, they paused the complaint and changed the rules, adopted the IHRA, and then they started to evaluate me against the IHRA, against completely different rules. I mean, completely absurd. But even against those new rules, I was found not to be an anti-Semite. You know, I mean, so the whole thing didn't work. But that's what they were attempting to do. So the creation and the rolling out of the IHRA definition has been something which they've spent a long time doing. It's been a concentrated effort, and they have that together with a whole series of organizations which they've set up in this country, and they do it in other countries. They certainly do it in the US. A whole series of organizations they set up. Some of them are funded directly by Israel, others just from the Zionist movement more generally, which the function of which is to do research on the left, on the Muslims, on the Arabs, on the Palestinians, and to find out stuff about them which they can use to have them sacked from their jobs, to have them removed from roles of importance, to have them step down as political candidates, etc., etc. I mean, that's the game, right? You change the definition of anti-Semitism, and you have a whole range of organizations whose function is to find out stuff which might be seen, if you look at it in a funny way, as anti-Semitism, and that's what they're up to.
And this attack on you was obviously coordinated. What role did your union play and the labor movement in Britain, the unions in Britain, to defend academics who are under attack because of criticism of Israel?
Well, I think the university sector is not ready for this. I mean, I know that in the US, you have much more experience of this. Joseph Mossad, Stephen Salaita, Norman Finkelstein going back, Mark Lamont Hill. But in the UK, we don't have so many examples. We've had some examples, but they're really starting with this process now. And there are currently in the UK cases at other universities, at Leeds, at Warwick, at Glasgow, at Birmingham, which are ongoing, which people don't know about, but some of them have been publicised. And so the universities themselves are not really clear on how to deal with it. I think that's probably been replicated in the US too. The unions, the problem is, of course, that the union membership can be divided because there is, there's a residual sympathy on the left for the idea of Israel, even if the practice of Israel is not liked on the left. But nevertheless, the unions have taken reasonably good positions. The UCU, the University and College Union in this country, passed a boycott motion many years ago, and there's been a big fight over that for a number of years. But we have quite strong policies on it. And my union at Bristol did defend me, and they paid for my legal counsel, etc., in the hearings process that I've gone through. And so I don't have any quarrel with that. I mean, there are issues about the politics of the union, etc. But it's something which people are not really geared up to fight just yet at a collective level. So the bureaucracy of the union has helped in supplying legal support, etc. But we're not at the stage, for example, of a mass walkout at Bristol. There is discontent at Bristol, and I'm sure that will grow. And of course, the question is how effectively that can grow, what effective pressure that can put on the University of Bristol.
Well, if they are able to get away with firing academics, teachers who are critical of Israel, accusing them of being anti-Semitic, where's that going to lead as far as the university as a place where you can actually have any real debate and discussion on these issues?
Well, I mean, it means that it's very, very difficult to have discussion. Not only is it very difficult to say anything about Israel-Palestine or about the plight of the Palestinians without being defamed and libeled as an anti-Semite. But it sends, as everyone recognizes, this sends a chill factor through the universities, so that people are not sure if they can discuss certain things in class, or if what might happen is that a recording of their lecture might be sent to a hostile newspaper, or students might complain about them, and it really undermines the whole set of relationships that there are between staff and students. The staff will have a variety of political views, a variety of different sorts of research in the area of social sciences, which might support one side or another in a particular conflict. But the idea that the students will be informing on staff, and that their political disagreements with staff will be taken seriously as a reason to terminate contracts or discipline staff is quite a new idea. And that, I mean, the fact they've sacked me is pretty unprecedented in this country. And no one so far has given me a precedent for this kind of activity.
And how long were you teaching at the University of Bristol?
I was there from 2018. So within 5 months of arriving, there'd been a complaint about me.
They have these lists in the United States. The ADL has collected lists. They have in fact, I myself was spied on. South African activists were spied on, and information was turned over to the apartheid government. So they have a long history. And one of the issues also that maybe you can address is the fact that Israel itself has worked with anti-Semites, given guns to regimes, Ukraine, where they had Nazi brigades, and that in history, the Zionists actually worked with the Nazis and had medals made because they had a similar racialist ideology that Jews did not belong in Germany, they belonged in Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, the example of the ADL is interesting, and the ADL is a fascinating organization that you'll know it since you've been spied on it a lot better than I will. but there's a similar organization here, and that was, of course, the organization which took the first complaint against me. That's called the Community Security Trust, and it's an organization which is very similar in its intended and stated purposes to the ADL, which is to defend Jewish people against discrimination and anti-Semitism. Now, of course, what it does in practice is a bit different, because it finds it very difficult, or rather, it doesn't really want to distinguish very clearly between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and it wants to try and tar the left and Muslims with the same brush as the far right, as being racist against Jews, which of course is not a reasonable comparison. So that's an organization which does compile blacklists. It does share those blacklists with the Home Office, which is the government department which houses the Internal Security Intelligence Organization, MI5, and which is responsible for the police and for the special branch, including the intelligence branches of the police. So that's a very similar organization, and it of course has, it's a matter of public record that it has had contacts with and training from Mossad, and that also it's thought that it shares information with Mossad. So it's not really surprising that that you get this kind of activity, but the fact of blacklists like that you have in the States, like the Canary Mission, etc., that's not nearly so developed here. And what we've seen with the attack on Corbyn is the development of organizations that can do that kind of activity. So in particular, there was the creation of a campaign against anti-Semitism, which is largely funded by the Jewish National Fund, one of the key planks at the center of the Zionist movement. and a whole range of other organizations which have existed to try and attack Labour members and others who have raised Palestinian rights. So we're developing quite fast, but we're not nearly at the level that it is in the US. And it's a new world now. So there's so many people now, hundreds of people who have lost their jobs or their positions or their elected positions in parties or in other places now as a result of this. And we ignore it, or we allow it to go on at our peril, because it will only get worse. Of course, what happens is that people who are on the left who don't get attacked, they quite often draw a line between them and the people who are attacked. And they say, well, those people were, they said things which were loose or not quite correct or something. And then, of course, what happens is that the witch hunt rolls on down the hill and gathers them up in the moss around the boulder, to mix my metaphors. And they're like, oh, this is terrible. Why are they doing it to us? We didn't think, we're not anti-Semites. And then, the people who were first targeted are saying, well, we did say, we said we've got to fight this, we've got to stop this and fight it. And more and more people, I think, recognize that. And there's a faction of the left which sort of collaborated with the witch hunt against Jeremy Corbyn, which is now sort of realizing that it's got, as it goes much further through the left, that we're all under threat from this. Anyone who raises the issue of Palestine in any way is a target.
And the Zionists in the United States have a long, long history. In fact, they were involved, the B'nai B'rith was involved in the House Un-American Activities Committee, targeting unionists and others for prosecution during the witch hunts, the anti-communist witch hunts by Joe McCarthy. So they actually worked with Joe McCarthy in the 50s to get rid of trade unions, to get rid of leftists, and to purge.
And let's be clear, Jewish leftists, right?
Jewish leftists. That's right. They were organized.
Get Jews out. That's right. I mean, and that's the same now. There's an organization in the Labour Party here called Jewish Voice for Labour, which is a left-wing Jewish organization, and they have 17 members on their executive committee. 11 have been accused of anti-Semitism by the Labour Party, which is just crazy. I mean, these are not, they're not even all anti-Zionists. They're kind of, some of them are soft Zionists, some of them are anti-Zionist, and they're accused of anti-Semitism.
So those are Jews that are critical of what Israel is doing, and are being accused of self-hating Jews or anti-Semites, because they're critical of what Jews are doing. Now, also in relationship to what has been going on in Britain, there was an Al Jazeera investigation about the penetration of how they operated and under the undercover operations that they were engaged in. What was that all about?
Well, they had a journalist go undercover and join some of the Zionist organizations, and they filmed as they went around to different political events, and they could see, therefore, who was being linked to and by the Israelis, meaning from the embassy, and also by Zionist organizations, and lots of references to money and the like. And I remember there's a famous reference where an MP says, "Well, I didn't expect you to have the money in your bag," and they kind of laugh about this when they're being filmed undercover. And one of the people who was filmed in this process was an undercover operative for the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which of course was at the heart of the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, which the ministry has now been dissolved, but it was the ministry which was in charge of global counter-BDS activities. And this guy was there in the embassy in some kind of cover position called Shai Massot, and there were others as well who were active in trying to undermine the Labour Party, and indeed even the Conservative Party, and tried to target Conservative ministers who are deemed to be insufficiently supportive of the Israelis. And one of the things which was revealed in that program, of course, was that the Israeli embassy directly funds the Union of Jewish Students, which is the equivalent body to Hillel in the US. It's actually its formal name in the UK is B'nai B'rith Hillel Foundation, and so that's an indication of the link, the quite straightforward link between the Israeli state and the Union of Jewish Students, which of course itself is a pro-Israel organization, formerly part of the Zionist movement, and which took the complaints, the second tranche of complaints against me, and which have eventually got me sacked. And part of the rationale for sacking me has been that I have mentioned this. I've mentioned that the UJS is a formally Zionist organization, and the JSOCs in all universities in this country, the Jewish societies, are all part of the UJS, and the UJS is through its membership of its seat on the executive board of the World Union of Jewish Students, and that in turn membership of the World Zionist Organization, formerly part of the Zionist movement, and it's heretical to mention this, to mention that actually there is a political function to these organizations. They might have other functions, social functions, etc. They do. Many students don't even know the political functions, but nevertheless, they have a political function, and it's apparently not allowed to mention this because this hurts the feelings of particular students, or it is in some way abusive to mention the fact that they have a constitutional requirement to support Israel.
And in the United States, of course, Israel has a tremendous influence in Congress and actually intervened in the campaign against Obama. Israel was quite involved in Netanyahu. The investment by Israel in politicians and their intervention. Of course, the United States is talking about Russian intervention in the US election. But when it comes to Israel, it seems that's verbatim to discuss the role of Israel as far as intervening in US politics and Congress and what's going on politically in the United States. Is it the same in Britain?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a case a couple of years ago where a whole tranche of documents was released about this thing called the Integrity Initiative. And this was a project funded by the Foreign Office through a ostensibly independent think tank, the function of which was to counter Russian disinformation. Okay, and of course, what it ended up doing was attacking Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. So you had a really quite serious constitutional issue there, which was that the government at the time was undermining the elected leader of the opposition, which is simply not allowed even in the archaic rules of British democracy. And so we investigated this. Actually, it was hilarious. And it turned out that this was an MI6 operation, or an MI6 overseen operation, so that the MI6 put an officer in as chief operating officer of the think tank. And the reason that they had an officer overseeing this was because they didn't really trust the rest of the people in there, because they were all largely military intelligence, and nobody trusts military intelligence, right? So this is a crazy thing, and it was based in a mill in Scotland, an abandoned sawmill in Scotland was the registered office. And so the first thing the journalists did was they turned up there and there was nobody there. And then you realize that their actual office was in London, in a swanky office building in London, from where they were attacking the elected leader of the Labour Party with money from the Foreign Office. And that whole thing collapsed. The idea that this was actually about Russian disinformation, or that somehow that Jeremy Corbyn was Russian disinformation somehow, or an agent of Russian disinformation, was something which they tried to pin on him, but they failed to do that. They failed with that in a way which the accusation of anti-Semitism was much more successful at being pinned on him quite falsely. But there we are.
And I mean, the fact that former leader of the Labour Party was basically witch hunted out of the Labour Party, accused of being an anti-Semite, and that the government, sections of the government, and the Israelis were all involved in this really conspiracy to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. Why didn't Jeremy Corbyn take this on directly and really challenge the role of Israel in the UK and how they were intervening?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting question. So both Corbyn and the then shadowed Foreign Secretary did challenge it after the Al Jazeera program in the lobby, and they asked for an investigation of the role of the Israel lobby in British politics. The government ignored that, but they very quickly after that slid back from those kinds of positions, and really the lobby was able to peel sections of the left off one after the other, and they did that by going for individuals and targeting individuals and having them expelled, and then slowly and slowly they got to, in the end, to Corbyn, because there was nobody left to defend him, because people had been peeled off from that. And eventually, even the Corbyn appointed general secretary of the party had effectively appointed a subunit within the Labour Party to deal with anti-Semitism complaints in a way which was approved of by the Zionist movement. And they'd incorporated into their ideas about what was anti-Semitism, the very talking points which had been given to them effectively by the Zionist movement. So the party was taken over, so all that was left was Jeremy, and that was it. And he constitutionally, I mean, people say he's too nice, and probably that's true. He constitutionally isn't someone who draws a line, takes a fight. He wants to bring people along with him, and of course, the people were being peeled off, and so that he, in the end, had no allies left. And you can see when he was eventually suspended from the party, he's still suspended from the party. He's part of the Socialist Campaign Group, which now is much, much bigger than it was in Parliament than when he took over. There was something like 30 or so MPs in the Socialist Campaign Group. And where was the statement from them when he was suspended? Nothing. I mean, it's incredible. The left totally silent and defeated. And I think some of the left in the Labour Party still don't realise the scale of the defeat that's been inflicted upon them, not just by the Israelis and the Zionists, but predominantly by them.
Does this have anything to do with social democracy, that you can reform Israel, you can make Zionism better, that's the way to go? Issue of social democracy going to the right and basically going along with the needs of imperialism. I mean, what you think that has anything to do with it? I mean, it seems like what you're saying is the whole Labour Party was basically taken over by the Zionists, and they purged Jeremy Corbyn, suspended him, accusing him of being an anti-Semite. I mean, it seems like that party has basically capitulated politically and ideologically to Zionism.
And then the leadership campaign to replace Corbyn, the Zionists issued through, I think it was the Board of Deputies, issued a 10-point pledge, which all the candidates had to sign up to. So all the candidates were intimidated into signing up to something which effectively destroyed the possibility of standing up for Palestinian rights. And there we are. They were intimidated, and there was no possibility that anyone who won that election, even if the left-wing candidate had won, would be able to do anything because they signed up to these pledges. Pledges which no Democrat should sign up to.
And would that include not supporting, for example, your case and the witch hunts against critics of Israel?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, the Board of Deputies was amongst. If you look at the publicly available letters written to the University of Bristol urging me to be sacked, I challenge anyone who has any knowledge really of British politics to look at those letters and to say honestly that they knew the names of all these pro-Israel organizations. I mean, there's so many of them. I mean, extraordinary number of pro-Israel organizations. People don't even realize are pro-Israel organizations. They say, oh, look, the all-party parliamentary group in anti-Semitism, it's a cross-party group. That's just MPs and lords. There's nothing to do with the Israel lobby there. And you say, well, okay, so there's an organization which funds that. And who funds that organization? Oh, hang on, it's Zionists. So, well, very good. So that's something which people just don't have any conception of that, really, that the penetration that there is in civil society and in political society by pro-Israel forces.
And this campaign of the Zionists has been successful in your sacking. What do you think is going to change the situation? I mean, is there a growing understanding that this is a political and ideological fight against Zionism, and the role Zionism now is playing in England, UK, where they get away with sacking people who are critical of Israel?
Well, I think that there is a growing sense that that's the case, and there's a growing sense that you can't deal with this by apologizing or saying, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. That you have to say this is a political fight, and if we value the concept of democracy or the possibility of our country not being influenced by a hostile foreign power, then we have to stand up and say that this is a political campaign, and we oppose this political campaign. It's got nothing to do with the ethnicity or the ethnic identity or the religion of the people involved. Everyone knows that most Zionists are Christians, and tons of Jews are not Zionists. I mean, it's absurd, but nevertheless they keep trying this tactic of saying, well, anyone who criticizes Israel is by definition almost an anti-Semite. And we must resist that, and it must be resisted collectively by our institutions, or no one will be able to speak about Palestine. People want to speak about Palestine. You see the motion which was passed at Labour Party conference this year, very strong motion passed about Israel's apartheid system, etc., etc.
So the Labour Party passed a resolution saying Israel is an apartheid system. That was passed by the Labour Party conference at the same time that they're kicking out Jeremy Corbyn for being an anti-Semite.
Yes, that's right. And at the same time, as they bust in supporters for Keir Starmer, the new leader, and brought in armed police for his speech, just to demonstrate to the left that they couldn't say anything. And it didn't stop some people heckling. But so yes, I mean, that happened at the same time. So I mean, the unions are quite strong on this. And of course, you know, I mean, if I was the other side, I would be saying, well, we have to deal with that. But the union's quite strong on this, and the unions have quite a lot of votes at conference. And so the unions plus the actual delegates, to the extent that ordinary delegates were able to go, I mean, nevertheless, still it overwhelmingly passed. And that's an indication of this.
Well, doesn't that make the Labour Party an anti-Semite organization?
Well, yeah,
Israel is an apartheid state. I mean, it seems like that would be cause to say that the Labour Party is anti-Semite.
Sure, and of course the leadership immediately said that they wouldn't implement the policy, they were going to ignore it. But yes, of course, I mean, even was it last year or the year before, when the Palestine motion was passed then, and there's a sea of Palestinian flags, and people said, you know, this is not a safe place for Jews. And you think, what world is it they're living in where they think that Palestinian rights makes the world less safe for Jews? This is absurd. But nevertheless, that's the kind of argument they put.
So what can people do who want to support you and also get your job back? Do you have a campaign going and your website?
Yeah, I mean, there's a website called supportmiller.org. That's MILLER, all one word, .org. And you can follow the twists and turns of the case so far there. There's quite a lot of background information which people might not know about. And we've got a video which is quite entertaining about the which we call the Israel gravy train, where we reveal the amount of money that key parliamentarians who signed a letter against me have had from the Zionist movement and from trips to Israel, etc. So yes, there's quite a lot of activity going on there, and you know, I will go through an appeal process and then to an industrial tribunal probably, and I hope that I will get victory there. But you know, this is quite a significant defeat for me and for more broadly for free speech and for academic freedom. And it's a question of whether we can galvanize enough opposition to force a turnaround in this process.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with David Miller. He was a professor at the University of Bristol, sociologist, and began to take up the role of the Zionist and Zionism, and has been recently terminated by the university as a result of attacks by Zionists on him in an organized way. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek, David.
It's a pleasure.